The rain fell in thick sheets over the Catskill Mountains that October evening, turning the winding road into a ribbon of black glass. Margaret Evans gripped the steering wheel of her silver sedan, her knuckles white against the leather. The GPS on her phone had lost signal 20 minutes ago, and now she navigated by instinct alone, following the hand-painted wooden signs that promised Thornwood Estate was just 3 more miles ahead. She glanced at the passenger seat where her overnight bag sat, packed hastily that morning in their Manhattan apartment while Richard showered. Her husband of 7 years had insisted she join him for this corporate retreat, a weekend gathering at some exclusive mountain property owned by a business associate. Richard rarely included her in his professional life anymore, so when the invitation came, Margaret felt a flicker of hope that perhaps things between them might finally improve. The windshield wipers beat a frantic rhythm as she navigated. Another sharp curve. Through the downpour she caught glimpses of towering pine trees, standing like sentinels on either side of the road. The isolation was complete out here, miles from the nearest town, surrounded by nothing but wilderness and storm. Margaret was 34 years old, with chestnut hair that fell past her shoulders and green eyes that had once sparkled with ambition. She had been a promising architect before she married Richard, designing community centers and affordable housing projects that won recognition in trade publications. But somewhere along the way, her career had been set aside to support his rise through the financial sector, to attend the right parties, to smile at the right people, to become the perfect accessory for a man who collected beautiful things. The headlights finally illuminated a massive iron gate, its intricate scrollwork depicting intertwined roses and thorns. A small guardhouse stood to the left, and as Margaret pulled up, a man in a dark uniform emerged with an umbrella. He checked her name against a clipboard, made a brief phone call, then waved her through as the gates swung open with mechanical precision. The driveway wound through manicured grounds for nearly half a mile before Thornwood Estate revealed itself. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. The mansion rose from the storm like something from another century, a sprawling stone structure with Gothic arches and tall windows that glowed with warm golden light. Cars were already parked in the circular drive, luxury vehicles she recognized from Richard's world, the kind that cost more than most people earned in a decade. She parked near the entrance and gathered her things, making a dash through the rain to the covered portico. The massive oak doors opened before she could knock, and a formally dressed butler welcomed her inside with practiced elegance. The foyer took her breath away. Marble floors reflected the light from a chandelier that must have held 1,000 crystals. A grand staircase swept upward to the second floor, and everywhere she looked there were fresh flowers, priceless artwork, and the kind of understated luxury that announced its own importance through restraint rather than excess. Richard appeared from a doorway to her left, a champagne flute already in his hand. He was handsome in that polished way that came from expensive grooming and careful attention to appearance, his silver-streaked dark hair perfectly styled, his charcoal suit tailored to emphasize his athletic build, but his smile, Margaret noticed, did not reach his eyes. He kissed her cheek perfunctorily. His breath smelled of alcohol, and she realized he had already been drinking for some time. Richard guided her toward the main salon, where perhaps 30 guests mingled beneath another spectacular chandelier. Margaret recognized faces from newspaper society pages and financial news programs, the kind of people who shaped markets and influenced policy without ever appearing in the spotlight. Richard introduced her to various colleagues, though introduced was perhaps too generous a word. He presented her, the way one might present a new watch or a vintage wine, something to be admired briefly before the conversation moved on to more important matters. Margaret smiled and nodded and said the appropriate things, while inside she felt herself growing smaller with each passing minute. The evening's host had not yet appeared, though his presence was everywhere. The guests spoke of him in reverent tones, referring to someone named Dante, a man whose influence apparently extended far beyond mere business. Margaret caught fragments of conversation, mentions of ventures in shipping, real estate, and import operations that spanned continents. Whoever this Dante was, he commanded respect that bordered on fear. Dinner was announced at 8, and the guests filed into a formal dining room that could have hosted royalty. The table, stretched nearly 40 feet, set with china and crystal that sparkled under yet another magnificent chandelier. Margaret found her place card near the middle of the table, while Richard was seated several chairs away, next to a young blonde woman, whose dress left very little to imagination. The seat at the head of the table remained empty, as servants began pouring wine and presenting the first course. Margaret studied the faces around her, noting the nervous glances toward that vacant chair. The way conversation remained deliberately light, as if everyone was waiting for permission to speak freely. Then the room fell silent. Margaret turned to see a man entering through a private door near the head of the table. He was perhaps 45, with dark hair silvered at the temples, and eyes the color of storm clouds. His features were striking rather than conventionally handsome, with high cheekbones, a strong jaw, and a slight scar that traced along his left eyebrow. He wore a perfectly fitted black suit with no tie, the top button of his white shirt undone in a way that suggested comfortable authority rather than carelessness. This was Dante Rossi. He moved with the quiet confidence of a man who had never needed to announce his presence, because every room simply made space for him. As he took his seat, he nodded to various guests, his gaze moving around the table with sharp attention. When those storm-grey eyes met Margaret's, she felt something shift in her chest, a recognition she could not explain, as if some part of her had been waiting for this stranger without knowing it. Dante raised his glass. His voice was deep and smooth, carrying easily without effort. He welcomed his guests to Thornwood, spoke briefly about the weekend's agenda of business discussions and relaxation, and then toasted to profitable partnerships and enduring friendships. Everyone drank. The meal proceeded through 7 courses, each more exquisite than the last. Margaret found herself stealing glances toward the head of the table, studying Dante Rossi with the same analytical eye she had once used to examine architectural blueprints. There was something contained about him, a stillness that suggested immense power held carefully in check. When he spoke, others leaned in to listen. When he listened, others felt the weight of his complete attention. Richard, meanwhile, was growing louder with each glass of wine. His laughter carried too far, his gestures became too expansive, and his attention remained fixed on the blonde woman beside him. Margaret watched her husband touch the woman's arm, lean close to whisper in her ear, and she felt not jealousy, but a profound weariness, as if she had been carrying a heavy stone for years, and only now realized she could simply set it down. After dinner, the guests retired to various sitting rooms for cognac and conversation. Margaret excused herself, claiming fatigue from the drive, and found a quiet library on the second floor where she could be alone with her thoughts. The room was magnificent, floor-to-ceiling shelves filled with leather-bound volumes, a fireplace crackling warmly, and tall windows that looked out over the storm-swept mountains. She selected a book at random and settled into a wingback chair near the fire, though she could not focus on the words. Her mind kept returning to Richard, to the empty ritual their marriage had become, to the dreams she had abandoned one compromise at a time, until she no longer recognized the woman she saw in mirrors. She did not hear the door open, but suddenly she knew she was no longer alone. Margaret looked up to find Dante Rossi standing in the doorway, a tumbler of amber liquid in his hand, those storm-grey eyes studying her with frank curiosity. He apologized for intruding. His voice was different when he was not addressing a crowd, softer and somehow more intimate, as if he were sharing a secret rather than making conversation. He explained that this library was his personal retreat during these gatherings, a place where he could escape the performance of hosting. Margaret started to rise, to leave him to his sanctuary, but Dante gestured for her to remain. He crossed the room with that contained grace and took the chair opposite hers, settling into it with the ease of a man completely comfortable in his own domain. They began to talk. It started with books, since she held one in her hands. Dante spoke of literature with unexpected passion, revealing a mind that ranged from classical philosophy to contemporary fiction. Margaret found herself drawn into the conversation, sharing her own favorites, debating interpretations, laughing at his dry observations about certain overpraised authors. An hour passed without her noticing, then another, The storm continued to rage outside, but within this warm room, something gentle was taking shape. Dante asked about her life, her work, her interests, and he listened with that complete attention she had observed at dinner, as if nothing existed in the world except her words. Margaret heard herself speaking truths she had not shared with anyone, not even herself. She spoke of the architecture career she had set aside, the designs still locked in her mind, the buildings she had imagined that would never exist. She spoke of feeling invisible in her own life, of smiling so long her face had forgotten any other expression, of lying awake at night, wondering how she had become a ghost haunting her own story. Dante did not offer empty comfort or easy solutions. He simply listened, and when she finished, he said something that cracked open something frozen inside her. He said she described herself as if she were already finished, a completed painting hung in a frame. But he saw someone still in motion, someone whose best designs were still ahead of her, waiting for the courage to draw them. Margaret felt tears threatening and looked away toward the fire. No one had spoken to her like this in years. No one had looked at her as if she were a person rather than a decoration, a mind rather than a smile, a presence rather than an absence. The library door suddenly burst open. Richard stood in the doorway, his face flushed with alcohol and something darker. His voice was too loud when he demanded to know what his wife was doing hiding away with their host. The accusation beneath the question was unmistakable. Margaret rose, her heart pounding. She tried to explain that they had simply been talking, that nothing improper had occurred, but Richard was beyond reason. He crossed the room in 3 aggressive strides and grabbed her arm, his grip tight enough to leave marks. Dante rose from his chair. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Dante did not raise his voice. He did not move with aggression or threat. He simply stood there, those storm-grey eyes fixed on Richard with an expression that transformed his face into something ancient and dangerous. He spoke one sentence, low and precise. He suggested Richard release his wife immediately. Richard froze. Some instinct beyond alcohol and pride warned him that he had stumbled into territory far more dangerous than he understood. His grip loosened, and Margaret stepped away, her arm throbbing where his fingers had been. But Richard could not simply retreat. His pride demanded some final gesture, some way to assert dominance in a situation where he had none. He turned to Margaret, and what came out of his mouth next would change everything. He announced to the room loud enough that guests in the hallway could hear that his wife was not worth this host's attention. He catalogued her failures as a wife, her inadequacy as a partner, her uselessness in society. He revealed intimate details of their marriage that should never have been spoken aloud, deliberately humiliating her in front of a man he perceived as a rival. Margaret stood frozen, each word landing like a physical strike. 7 years of silence, of smiling through pain, of pretending everything was fine, and now her most private shames were being broadcast to strangers in a house she did not know, by a man she had promised to love. When Richard finished, breathing hard from his tirade, Dante Rossi spoke. His voice remained perfectly level, which somehow made it more terrifying. He informed Richard that his car was being brought around. He suggested Richard leave Thornwood immediately and not return. This was not a request. Richard sputtered protests about business dealings, about the important discussions scheduled for tomorrow, about the connections he stood to make. Dante cut him off with a single raised hand. Whatever business they might have conducted was concluded. Whatever partnership Richard had imagined would never exist. He should leave while he still could. 2 men appeared in the doorway, large and professionally blank-faced. They escorted Richard out without touching him, their presence alone, sufficient to compel compliance. Margaret heard her husband's protests fading down the hallway, then silence. She remained standing in the library, trembling, unable to process what had just occurred. Dante did not approach her. He remained by his chair, giving her space, waiting for her to choose what happened next. Margaret looked at this stranger who had defended her honor, this powerful man whose name inspired fear in others, and she saw only quiet concern in those storm-grey eyes. She asked, why? Why had he intervened? Why did he care what happened to the wife of a business associate he barely knew? Dante's answer was simple. He said he did not tolerate cruelty in his home. He said everyone deserved to be spoken to with respect, especially someone who had done nothing wrong. He said some men revealed their true nature only when they believed they held power. And what Richard had revealed was something Dante would not permit under his roof. Margaret sank back into her chair, the adrenaline draining from her body and leaving exhaustion in its wake. She asked what she should do now. Her husband had the car. Her phone had no signal. She was stranded in the mountains during a storm with no way to leave. Dante assured her she was welcome to stay at Thornwood as long as she needed. A guest room would be prepared for her. Tomorrow, when the storm passed, she could decide her next steps with a clear mind. Tonight, she should rest. He called for the butler, who appeared instantly as if he had been waiting just outside the door. Arrangements were made. A room was prepared on the guest wing, far from where the other corporate visitors were staying. A maid brought Margaret's overnight bag from her car. Everything was handled with quiet efficiency. Before she left the library, Margaret turned back to face Dante Rossi. She thanked him. The words felt inadequate for what he had done, for what he had witnessed, for the strange kindness he had shown a woman he did not know. Dante nodded once. He told her that morning often brought clarity that night could not provide. He suggested she sleep, and that they could speak more tomorrow if she wished. Then he turned back to the fire, granting her privacy to process the evening's events. Margaret followed the butler through the mansion's corridors to a beautiful guest suite decorated in soft blues and creams. The bed was enormous, the sheets crisp and cool, and through the windows she could see lightning, illuminating the mountains in brief silver flashes. She stood at the glass for a long time watching the storm, feeling as if she too had been illuminated by something unexpected. Her marriage was over. She had known it for years, perhaps, but tonight had made it impossible to pretend otherwise. The man she had married had become someone capable of deliberately humiliating her before strangers, of trying to diminish her value so that no one else would see worth in her. That was not love. That was not even partnership. That was ownership, and Margaret was finished being owned. She slept fitfully, her dreams tangled with images of rain and fire and storm-grey eyes that saw through pretense to truth beneath. When she woke, the storm had passed, and pale autumn sunlight streamed through the windows. The mountains beyond were draped in mist, beautiful and mysterious, and Margaret felt something she had not experienced in years. She felt hope. Check if you're already subscribed to this channel. If you are not, consider joining us now, because here we tell stories that touch the soul, stories of courage and transformation that remind us we are never truly alone. Subscribe and become part of this community of hearts. The morning brought unexpected normalcy. Margaret showered and dressed in the simple clothes she had packed, then made her way downstairs following the scent of fresh coffee. She expected awkwardness, expected to feel like an intruder among guests who had witnessed her humiliation the night before. Instead, she found the breakfast room nearly empty. The butler explained that most guests had departed early. The business discussions had been cancelled. Only a few remained, and they were occupied with their own affairs elsewhere in the estate. Margaret ate alone by a window overlooking the gardens, watching groundskeepers tend to storm damage among the roses. The food was exquisite, fresh fruit and warm pastries, and eggs prepared exactly as she liked them, though she could not remember telling anyone her preferences. Every detail at Thornwood seemed anticipated, every comfort provided before the need arose. She was finishing her second cup of coffee when Dante Rossi appeared in the doorway. He looked different in daylight, less formal in dark jeans and a charcoal sweater, though no less commanding. He asked if he might join her, and Margaret found herself nodding before she could overthink the gesture. They sat across from each other in the morning light, and the conversation flowed more easily than Margaret would have expected. Dante asked how she had slept, whether she needed anything, if she had been able to reach anyone who might help her arrange transportation. His concern seemed genuine, absent of any ulterior motive she could detect. Margaret admitted she had not yet called anyone. She did not know who to call. Her parents lived in Arizona and were too elderly to be burdened with this crisis. Her few remaining friends had gradually drifted away during her marriage, casualties of Richard's social engineering. She had built her entire life around a man who had just publicly discarded her, and now she saw how deliberately he had isolated her. Dante listened without judgment. When she finished, he made a simple offer. She was welcome to remain at Thornwood while she determined her next steps. The estate was large enough that she would have complete privacy. There were cars available if she needed to travel anywhere, staff who could assist with practical matters, and no pressure to leave before she was ready. Margaret started to refuse. She could not impose on a stranger's hospitality, could not accept charity from a man she had just met, could not make herself more vulnerable than she already was. But Dante anticipated her objections. He explained that hospitality was not charity. He explained that Thornwood had been built by his grandfather as a place where those who needed shelter could find it. He explained that the estate was used for business, perhaps 3 weekends a year, and the rest of the time it stood mostly empty, maintained by staff who would welcome someone to care for. He was returning to the city that afternoon, but the house would remain open to her. There was something in the way he spoke that made Margaret believe him, not just his words, but the steadiness behind them, the sense that this man said only what he meant and meant everything he said. She found herself accepting, at least for a few days, just until she could think clearly and make a plan. Dante nodded, satisfied. He provided a phone number where he could be reached if she needed anything. He introduced her to the head of household staff, a dignified woman named Elena, who immediately took Margaret under her wing with maternal efficiency. He showed her the grounds, the gardens, the greenhouse, the stable with its 3 gentle horses, the walking trails that wound through the forest. By the time he departed that afternoon, Margaret felt less like a refugee and more like a guest, perhaps even a friend. The days that followed were strange and healing. Margaret walked the mountain trails each morning, breathing air that tasted of pine and freedom. She read books from Dante's magnificent library, discovering annotations in the margins that revealed his thoughts on passages she loved. She helped Elena in the kitchen, learning recipes passed down through generations of the Rossi family. She sat with the gardeners and learned the names of flowers she had never noticed before. Slowly, she began to remember who she had been before Richard. The young architect who stayed up all night perfecting designs, the curious student who asked questions others were afraid to voice, the dreamer who believed buildings could change communities, could bring people together, could create spaces where human connection flourished. She began to sketch again, first hesitantly, on the backs of envelopes, and the margins of newspapers, then more boldly, filling pages with ideas that had been locked away for years. Elena found her a proper sketchbook and a set of architectural pencils, claiming she had discovered them in a storage closet, though Margaret suspected Dante had sent them. They spoke on the phone each evening. It began as a practical matter, Dante checking that she had everything she needed, Margaret reporting on her progress toward deciding her future. But the calls grew longer, the subjects more varied, the silences between words more comfortable. She told him about her designs. He told her about his business, describing his import operations and real estate holdings in careful terms that never quite explained the fear she had seen in Richard's eyes. Margaret was not naive. She understood that Dante Rossi was not merely a successful businessman. The security around the estate, the deference shown by everyone who mentioned his name, the way conversations stopped when he entered rooms, all pointed to something more than legitimate enterprise. But she also saw how he treated Elena and the other staff, with respect and genuine warmth. She saw how he spoke about the local community, the scholarships he funded, the hospital wing he had built in his mother's memory. Whatever else Dante Rossi might be, he was not the villain of her story. 2 weeks passed. Margaret had spoken to a lawyer in the city, had begun the process of extricating herself from her marriage. Richard had apparently disappeared into his own spiral. Whether of shame or anger she did not know and did not care. The apartment in Manhattan was in his name, but she discovered that she still had some savings Richard had not known about, enough to start over somewhere modest. She began researching small apartments, looking at job listings, imagining a life that was entirely her own. On the 15th day, Dante returned to Thornwood. He arrived in the late afternoon, just as the autumn sun was painting the mountains in shades of gold and amber. Margaret was in the garden, sketching the old stone wall that bordered the rose beds, when she heard the car approach. She looked up to see him walking toward her across the lawn, and something in her chest that had been dormant for years began to wake. They had dinner together that evening, just the two of them, in a small dining room she had not known existed. The conversation flowed like water, finding its natural course, touching on philosophy and music, and the nature of home. Dante asked to see her sketches, and Margaret found herself sharing ideas she had never shown anyone, designs for community spaces and affordable housing and parks where children could play safely. He studied each page with serious attention, asking questions that revealed his own understanding of architecture and urban planning. When he finished, he looked at her with those storm-grey eyes and said something that made her heart stop. He said he owned several properties in the city that needed redevelopment. He said he had been looking for an architect who understood that buildings were not just structures, but statements about human dignity. He said he would like to offer her a commission, a real project with real budget and real creative freedom, if she was interested. Margaret's first instinct was to refuse. This felt too much like charity, too much like being rescued again. But Dante seemed to anticipate this objection as well. He slid a folder across the table. Inside were photographs and specifications for 3 properties in different neighborhoods, each with unique challenges and possibilities. He had not invented this project for her sake. These buildings had been waiting for the right vision. He had simply been unable to find it until now. Margaret looked at the photographs, her architect's eye immediately identifying problems and solutions, imagining transformations that would turn these neglected spaces into thriving communities. This was real work, important work, the kind of work she had dreamed about in the years before Richard convinced her that dreams were childish. She said yes. The weeks that followed were the most professionally fulfilling of Margaret's life. She threw herself into the projects, spending hours on site, meeting with contractors, revising designs until every detail was perfect. Dante provided resources, but did not interfere, trusting her vision even when it diverged from his initial expectations. The buildings began to take shape, and Margaret watched her ideas become reality with growing wonder. She remained at Thornwood, though the estate had ceased to feel like refuge and become something closer to home. Eleanor and the staff had become family. The gardens knew her footsteps. The library held books she had read and reread until their words were written on her heart. And always there was Dante. He traveled frequently for business, gone sometimes for days at a time, but he always returned to Thornwood, and increasingly Margaret understood that he returned for her. Their evening conversations had evolved into something richer, their silences more eloquent than other people's speeches. She knew the sound of his car on the gravel drive. He knew which flowers she preferred for the breakfast table. They had become essential to each other without ever naming what was growing between them. One evening in late November, with the first snow beginning to fall outside the library windows, Dante told her the truth about who he was. He spoke for over an hour, his voice steady but soft, as if the words cost him something to release. He told her about his family's history, generations of men who had built an empire outside the law. He told her about the choices he had made, some he regretted and some he would make again. He told her about the careful work of recent years to transform the family business into something legitimate, to honor his mother's dying wish that her son become a man she could be proud of. Margaret listened without interruption. When he finished, she understood the fear in Richard's eyes, the deference of the other guests, the scope of security that surrounded Thornwood. She understood that loving this man would mean accepting complications she could not fully imagine. She understood that walking away was still possible, still sensible, still safe. She did not walk away. Instead, she reached across the space between their chairs and took his hand. She told him that everyone carried shadows. She told him that she had spent years married to a man who appeared respectable while treating her with contempt, and she had learned that appearance meant nothing compared to truth. She told him that she had watched him for weeks now, seen how he treated those with less power, how he honored his promises, how he worked to become better than his history. That was the man she knew. That was the man she chose. Dante lifted her hand to his lips and pressed a kiss against her fingers. His storm-grey eyes were bright with emotion he usually kept carefully contained. He told her she saw him more clearly than anyone ever had. He told her he had been waiting his whole life for someone who could look at all he was and choose to stay. The snow fell heavily through the night, blanketing Thornwood in white silence. Inside the library, by the warmth of the fire, Margaret and Dante built the foundation of something neither had expected to find. Not rescue, but partnership. Not escape, but choice. Not fairy tale, but something better. Two imperfect people deciding to become more together than they could be apart. When Margaret woke the next morning in the blue guest room that had become her own, she looked out at the snow-covered mountains and smiled. Her old life was truly behind her now. The divorce papers were nearly finalized. The architecture projects were progressing beautifully. And somewhere in this enormous house, there was a man who looked at her as if she were the most remarkable thing he had ever encountered. She dressed and went downstairs to find Dante in the small dining room, 2 cups of coffee already steaming on the table. He looked up when she entered, and his rare smile transformed his usually serious face into something almost boyish. He said good morning in that low voice that had become the soundtrack of her new life. Margaret sat across from him, wrapping her hands around the warm cup, and began to tell him about a new idea she had for the community center on the 3rd property. Her words came quickly, animated by enthusiasm, and Dante listened with that complete attention that made her feel like the only person in the world. This was her life now. Not perfect, not simple, but real. And that was more than she had ever dared to hope. The winter deepened, and with it, Margaret's commitment to her new existence. She spent long hours in a temporary office Dante had set up for her at Thornwood, drafting designs and communicating with contractors in the city. The first building was nearly complete, a former warehouse transformed into affordable apartments with a community garden on the roof. The local newspaper had run a story about the project, praising its innovative design and community focus, though carefully omitting any mention of who had funded the development. Margaret understood that anonymity was essential to Dante's world. The work she did would never bear his name, and sometimes it would not bear hers either. But she could see the impact in the faces of families who toured the new apartments, in the children who would play in parks she had designed, in the seniors who would gather in community rooms she had imagined. That was enough. That was more than enough. Dante's business continued to demand his attention, though he shared more details with her now. The legitimate operations were expanding, shipping companies and import businesses and real estate holdings. That produced genuine profit, without the shadows of his family's past. The transformation was gradual but real, old relationships carefully concluded, new partnerships built on different foundations. Not everyone welcomed this change. Margaret learned that Dante had rivals who saw his legitimization as weakness, competitors who had operated in the same shadows and resented his departure from that world. There were threats sometimes, veiled warnings delivered through intermediaries, but Dante handled them with the same contained competence he brought to everything. He never seemed afraid, and gradually Margaret stopped being afraid for him. The divorce from Richard was finalized in January, on a day when the sky was clear and cold and the sun sparkled on fresh snow. Margaret signed the final papers in a lawyer's office in the city, then walked out into the bright afternoon feeling lighter than she had in years. She was free, legally, officially, completely free. She took the train, back to the mountains that evening, watching the city lights give way to darkness and then to the softer glow of small towns along the Hudson. When she arrived at Thornwood, Dante was waiting in the foyer, though she had not told him which train she would take. He always seemed to know when she was coming home. He took her coat and handed her a glass of champagne. In the library, where they had first truly spoken, he had arranged a small celebration. Eleanor had prepared her favorite dishes. There were flowers everywhere, the winter roses she loved from the greenhouse, and on the mantel, propped against a first-edition volume of her favorite novel, was a small velvet box. Margaret's heart stopped. Dante did not kneel. That would have been too conventional for a man who seemed to reject convention at every turn. Instead, he stood before her in the firelight, those storm-grey eyes holding hers with unusual vulnerability, and spoke. He told her that he had spent his life accumulating power, because it was the only safety he knew. He told her that she had shown him a different kind of strength, the courage to rebuild rather than to destroy, to create rather than to control. He told her that Thornwood had never felt like home until she walked through its doors, and that he never wanted to spend another day without her in it. Then he opened the box. The ring was simple and stunning, an emerald surrounded by small diamonds, the green stone almost exactly the color of her eyes. Dante asked if she would consider, if she would possibly, if she could imagine spending the rest of her life with a man who was still learning how to be worthy of her. Margaret laughed and cried and said yes. The engagement was quiet, known only to Elena and the Thornwood staff who had become Margaret's family. There would be no society announcements, no newspaper features, no elaborate parties. That kind of spectacle belonged to her old life with Richard. This new life was private and precious, and hers. She continued her work on the architecture projects, driven now by even greater purpose. Dante began delegating more responsibilities to trusted lieutenants, freeing himself to spend more time at Thornwood, more time with her. They took walks through the snowy forest, had long dinners by the fire, spent quiet evenings reading in the library that had first brought them together. Spring arrived slowly in the mountains, the snow retreating to reveal patches of brown earth, and then the first brave shoots of new growth. The gardens that had been dormant began to stir, and Margaret helped the groundskeepers plan the summer plantings, choosing flowers that would bloom in waves of color through the warm months. If at this moment you are feeling something in your heart, leave a comment saying, "This story is speaking directly to my soul." I want to know that you are here with me, sharing this journey of transformation and hope. The wedding was set for June, when the roses would be at their peak. Margaret wanted a small ceremony, just Elena and a few trusted friends, held in the garden she had come to love. Dante agreed to everything she wanted, claiming he cared only that she became his wife, not how the event was conducted. But first, there was something Margaret needed to do. She traveled to Arizona to see her parents, whom she had not visited in nearly 2 years. Richard had always found reasons to avoid her family, and eventually Margaret had stopped trying to overcome his objections. Now free of that constraint, she rented a car at the Phoenix airport and drove through the desert to the small retirement community where her parents had settled. They were older than she remembered, her father thinner and her mother more grey, but their eyes lit up when they saw her walking across the parking lot. Her mother cried. Her father pretended he was not crying. They held her and welcomed her and asked no questions about why she had stayed away so long. Over 3 days, Margaret told them everything. The slow dissolution of her marriage, the night at Thornwood, the transformation that had followed. She told them about Dante, carefully omitting the details that would only frighten them, emphasizing instead his kindness, his integrity, his devotion. She showed them photographs of her architecture projects, the buildings rising in the city, the communities taking shape around her designs. Her parents listened with the accepting love that had always characterized their family. Her father asked if she was happy, truly happy, and Margaret realized she could answer honestly for the first time in years. Yes, she was happy. She had found her way back to herself, and in doing so, she had found someone who saw and valued who she truly was. When she left Arizona, her parents promised to come to the wedding. Her mother began immediately researching what to wear, and her father quietly mentioned that he would be proud to walk her down the aisle again, if she wanted. Margaret returned to Thornwood feeling complete, in a way she had not experienced since childhood. All the fragmented pieces of her life were finally coming together, not into the picture she had once imagined, but into something better, something real. The wedding preparations accelerated as June approached. Eleanor took charge with the focused efficiency of a general marshalling troops. Flowers were ordered, menus planned, guest quarters prepared for the small number of attendees. Margaret found a simple cream-colored dress in a vintage shop in the nearby town, and when she tried it on, Eleanor burst into tears and declared it perfect. Dante, meanwhile, was handling preparations of a different sort. The wedding would bring together people from different parts of his life, some of whom had never met. He spent hours on phone calls, smoothing relationships, ensuring that everyone understood the importance of this day and the necessity of keeping it peaceful. 1 week before the ceremony, an unexpected visitor arrived at Thornwood. His name was Vincent Caruso, and he was one of Dante's oldest associates, a man who had worked alongside the Rossi family for decades. He was perhaps 60, with silver hair and a face that bore the marks of a difficult life. But his eyes were sharp and his manner respectful as he asked to speak with Dante privately. Margaret watched from an upstairs window as the two men walked together through the garden. She could not hear their conversation, but she could read the tension in their postures, the careful distance maintained between them. When they finally shook hands and Vincent departed, Dante stood alone among the roses for a long time before coming inside. That evening he told her what had been discussed. Vincent had come as an emissary from certain interests who were unhappy with Dante's continued transformation of the family business. They saw his wedding to an outsider as the final step in his abandonment of their world, and they had sent Vincent with a message: reconsider or face consequences. Margaret felt fear then, real fear, the kind she had not experienced since those first nights at Thornwood. She asked what this meant, what these consequences might be, whether she was in danger. Dante took her hands in his. He spoke with the steady confidence that had always characterized him, the absolute certainty that came from a lifetime of navigating dangerous waters. He told her that Vincent was an old friend who had delivered the message reluctantly, and who had also provided valuable information about who was behind it. He told her that he had already taken precautions, already positioned people and resources to neutralize any threat. He told her that the wedding would proceed as planned, and that nothing and no one would prevent her from becoming his wife. Margaret believed him, not because she was naive or trusting by nature, but because she had seen what Dante was capable of, had watched him handle complications that would overwhelm lesser men. If he said she was safe, she was safe. If he said the wedding would happen, it would happen. That was simply who he was. The days before the ceremony passed in a blur of preparations and anticipation. Margaret's parents arrived and were installed in the finest guest suite, where her mother immediately began commenting on the flower arrangements, and her father walked the grounds with quiet appreciation. Elena orchestrated the final details, with meticulous care, ensuring that every element would be perfect. The night before the wedding, Margaret found herself unable to sleep. She walked through the darkened house, her bare feet silent on the cool marble, until she reached the library that had become their sanctuary. She curled into her favorite chair and watched the moon rise over the mountains, thinking about all the improbable turns that had brought her to this moment. Dante found her there an hour later. He was also sleepless, also reflective, also aware that tomorrow would change everything. He sat in the chair across from her, not speaking, simply being present. They watched the moonlight together until exhaustion finally claimed them, falling asleep in their chairs as they had so many times before. The wedding morning dawned clear and perfect, the June sky a deep, pure blue, the air scented with roses and possibility. Margaret woke in her room to find Elena already bustling about, laying out her dress, arranging the small bouquet that would complete her outfit. The ceremony would be at noon in the garden, under an arch covered with white and red roses. She dressed slowly, savoring each moment. The vintage dress fit perfectly, skimming her figure without clinging, its simple elegance exactly right for the woman she had become. Elena helped with her hair, arranging it in a soft, upswept style that left tendrils framing her face. Minimal makeup, her grandmother's pearl earrings, the emerald engagement ring on her finger. When she looked in the mirror, Margaret barely recognized herself, not because she looked different, but because she finally looked like who she had always been meant to be. Strong, clear-eyed, ready. Her father knocked at precisely 11:30. He was wearing his best suit, the one he had bought for her first wedding to Richard, and his eyes grew misty when he saw her. He told her she was beautiful. He told her he was proud. He told her that he had prayed for this day, for her to find real happiness, and his prayers had been answered. They walked together through the house and out into the garden, where perhaps 20 guests were seated on white chairs along a rose-lined aisle. Margaret saw Elena dabbing at her eyes. She saw her mother smiling through happy tears. She saw familiar faces from Thornwood's staff, people who had become family over these past months, and at the end of the aisle, standing beneath the flower-covered arch, she saw Dante. He was wearing a dark suit, simpler and more elegant than anything she had seen him wear before. His silver-touched hair was perfectly styled. His storm-grey eyes were fixed on her with an intensity that made her breath catch. He looked like what he was, a powerful man made vulnerable by love, a man of shadows learning to live in light. The ceremony was brief and beautiful. They had written their own vows, and Margaret's voice trembled as she spoke of transformation and second chances and the courage to choose love over fear. Dante's voice was steady but soft, speaking of walls that had crumbled and sanctuaries that had formed, and a future he had never imagined until she walked into his life. When the officiant pronounced them married, Dante kissed her with a tenderness that made the small crowd sigh. Then they turned to face their guests as husband and wife, and Margaret felt something settle into place inside her, a rightness she had spent years searching for without knowing what she was looking for. The reception was intimate and joyful, good food and better wine and laughter that echoed through the garden. Margaret's mother pulled Dante aside at one point, and though Margaret could not hear their conversation, she saw her mother pat his cheek with approval. Her father and Dante shook hands with the solemnity of men who understand the weight of responsibility. As evening approached and the guests began to disperse, Margaret stood alone at the edge of the garden, looking out over the mountains she had come to love. Dante appeared beside her, slipping an arm around her waist, drawing her close. He asked what she was thinking. Margaret leaned into him and spoke the truth. She was thinking about the night she had arrived at Thornwood, terrified and alone, her entire life in ruins. She was thinking about the woman she had been then and the woman she was now. She was thinking about the impossible, improbable path that had led her to this moment, standing in a garden full of roses, married, to a man who saw her, truly saw her, for the first time in her life. Dante pressed a kiss to her temple. He said that path had led them both somewhere unexpected. He said he had built Thornwood as a fortress against the world, and she had turned it into a home. He said he had spent years accumulating power, and she had shown him that true strength was the willingness to be changed by love. They stood together as the sun set over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose, and purple. The guests were gone. The garden was quiet except for birdsong and the distant murmur of the staff cleaning up. For this one perfect moment, the world held only the two of them and the future they would build together. The months following the wedding were the happiest of Margaret's life. She completed her architecture projects, watching the buildings fill with families and communities that thrived in spaces she had imagined. She began new designs, more ambitious than before, including a community center that would serve underprivileged neighborhoods with programs for children and seniors and everyone in between. Dante continued his work of transforming the family business, and with each passing month, the shadows retreated further. Old operations were concluded, old alliances dissolved, new ventures established on foundations of legitimacy. There were still complications, still people who resented his departure from their world, but he handled them with the same competence he brought to everything. Thornwood truly became home, not just a refuge, but a foundation for their life together. Margaret redesigned several rooms, adding her own aesthetic to spaces that had been unchanged for generations. She established a small studio in the East Wing, where she could work surrounded by the mountain views that had first captured her heart. She learned to ride the horses in the stable, overcoming a childhood fear with Dante's patient encouragement. They traveled occasionally, to cities where Dante had business, and to places they simply wanted to see together. Paris in autumn, Rome in spring, the coastline of Maine in summer, where they rented a small cottage and spent a week completely alone, cooking simple meals and walking beaches and learning every detail of each other's histories. Margaret's parents visited twice, growing more comfortable with their daughter's unexpected new life. Her mother and Elena became unlikely friends, bonding over recipes and flowers and the shared project of caring for Margaret. Her father and Dante discovered a mutual appreciation for chess and single malt whiskey, spending evenings in the library, engaged in battles that seemed to satisfy some male need for competition. A year passed, then another. Margaret turned 37, then 38, watching herself age with equanimity in mirrors that had once reflected only anxiety. She was doing work she loved with a man who loved her, surrounded by people who had become family. The life she had once imagined, the prestigious Manhattan existence with Richard, seemed like a story about someone else, a cautionary tale about mistaking appearance for substance. And then, one morning in early spring, Margaret realized something had changed. She had been feeling different for weeks, tired in unfamiliar ways, sensitive to smells that usually did not bother her, emotional at unexpected moments. She mentioned it to Elena, who gave her a knowing look and suggested a simple test might explain everything. The test was positive. Margaret stood in the bathroom of the suite she shared with Dante, staring at the small plastic indicator, feeling the world reorganize itself around this new information. She was pregnant. After years of believing Richard's implications that she was somehow deficient, that her failure to conceive was her fault alone, her body had proven itself capable of this miracle with a man who actually loved her. She found Dante in his office, reviewing documents with the focused attention he brought to everything. When she appeared in the doorway, he looked up immediately, attuned to her presence as always. His brow furrowed with concern as he registered something different in her expression. Margaret crossed the room and sat in the chair beside his desk. She took his hand. She told him. The transformation in his face was something she would remember for the rest of her life. The composed, controlled man she had married dissolved into something raw and more human. His storm-grey eyes filled with tears he did not try to hide. His voice broke when he asked if she was certain. She was certain. Dante pulled her from the chair into his arms, holding her with desperate tenderness, pressing kisses to her hair and her forehead and her cheeks. He said he had never imagined this. He said he had believed this part of life was closed to him, that the choices he had made had forfeited such blessings. He said she had already given him more than he deserved, and now this. They held each other in his office while the spring sunlight poured through the windows, two people who had found each other against all probability, now facing a future neither had dared to dream. The pregnancy progressed smoothly through spring and into summer. Margaret continued her work as long as she could, though she gradually delegated more responsibilities to the talented young architects she had begun to mentor. She wanted to be present. For this experience, fully present, in a way her previous life had never allowed. Dante became almost comically protective. He hired additional medical staff to be available at Thornwood at all times. He researched prenatal nutrition until he knew more than Margaret's doctors. He redesigned the nursery 3 times, each iteration more elaborate than the last, until Margaret finally intervened and chose a simple, beautiful room with windows overlooking the garden. Eleanor was beside herself, with joy immediately beginning to prepare for a baby she already called our little one. The entire household staff seemed to vibrate with anticipation, everyone contributing something to the preparations, everyone invested in this new chapter of Thornwood's story. In October, with the leaves turning gold and red on the mountain slopes, Margaret went into labor. The birth was difficult but not dangerous. Long hours of effort that tested her endurance but never overwhelmed it. Dante remained at her side throughout, holding her hand, whispering encouragement, his usual composure stripped away to reveal the terrified, hopeful man beneath. At 3 in the morning, with the autumn moon shining through the window, Margaret held her daughter for the first time. She was perfect. Tiny and red-faced and absolutely perfect. 10 fingers, 10 toes, a wisp of dark hair, and eyes that would eventually settle into her father's storm grey. Margaret cradled this impossible miracle against her chest and felt love so profound it transcended language, a cellular recognition of purpose that rearranged everything she thought she knew about herself. Dante leaned over them both, his face wet with tears, his voice reduced to broken whispers. He touched the baby's cheek with one careful finger, as if afraid she might shatter at his touch. He looked at Margaret with an expression of such profound gratitude that she understood words would never capture what he felt. They named her Elena Rose, after the woman who had made Thornwood a home and the flowers that had first brought them together. Little Eleanor, who would grow up surrounded by love, who would never know the loneliness her mother had experienced, who would have two parents utterly devoted to her flourishing. The months following Elena's birth were exhausting and exhilarating. Margaret discovered reserves of strength she had not known she possessed, functioning on fragmented sleep, responding to needs that could not be scheduled, loving her daughter with a fierceness that sometimes frightened her. Dante, the powerful man who commanded respect from dangerous people, was reduced to helpless adoration in his daughter's presence. He held her for hours, singing lullabies in Italian that his own mother had sung to him. He changed diapers with surprising competence. He walked the floors at night when she could not sleep, his deep voice rumbling soothing nonsense until she finally relaxed against his chest. They became a family. Not the family Margaret had once imagined, the respectable Manhattan couple with appropriate children and appropriate ambitions. This family was stranger and more beautiful, built on foundations of transformation and second chances, rooted in a mountain estate that had witnessed its share of darkness before learning to hold light. Little Elena grew quickly, as babies do. She learned to smile, to laugh, to reach for her parents' faces with chubby hands. She was a happy child, calm and curious, observing the world around her with storm-grey eyes that seemed already to understand more than they should. Margaret returned to her architecture work gradually, bringing Elena to her studio, designing buildings while her daughter played on a blanket nearby. The community center she had envisioned was finally complete, a space where children attended after-school programs and seniors gathered for meals and immigrants found resources to navigate their new country. At the opening ceremony, which Margaret attended anonymously, she watched families use the space she had created and felt a satisfaction deeper than any award or recognition could provide. Dante's transformation continued as well. With a daughter to consider, the urgency of leaving his old world behind intensified. He accelerated the transition of remaining questionable operations, accepted lower returns in exchange for cleaner structures, made peace with rivals where possible, and simply outlasted them where not. By Elena's first birthday, the Rossi business interests were more legitimate than they had been in 3 generations, but the shadows of the past were not easily escaped. One evening in late spring, when Elena was just beginning to toddle around the garden under Elena Senior's watchful eye, a letter arrived at Thornwood. It was addressed to Margaret, delivered by hand rather than through the regular mail, and when she opened it, her hands began to shake. The letter was from Richard, her ex-husband, whom she had not seen or heard from in nearly 3 years, had tracked her down. The letter was rambling and bitter, accusing her of destroying his life, blaming her for the downfall of his career, threatening to expose her relationship with Dante to people who would use that information to hurt them. Margaret brought the letter to Dante immediately. He read it with an expression of cold focus that reminded her of the man she had first met, the man whose power had silenced Richard in the library that storm-swept night. When he finished, he set the letter aside and was quiet for a long moment. Then he made a phone call. Margaret never knew exactly what was said or to whom. She only knew that 3 days later, Dante told her the situation had been handled. Richard would not contact them again. He would not threaten them again. The details were not something she needed to worry about. She chose not to ask questions. She had made her peace with who Dante was and what he was capable of. This was part of the bargain, part of the life she had chosen. Her daughter was safe. Her family was protected. That was what mattered. The years that followed were good ones. Elena grew into a bright, happy child, attending a small private school in the nearby town, making friends, learning to ride the horses, helping her grandmother Elena in the kitchen. She was curious about everything, filling notebooks with drawings and observations, asking questions that sometimes left her educated parents scrambling for answers. Margaret's architecture practice flourished. She designed a dozen more buildings, each focused on community and accessibility, each a testament to her belief that good design could change lives. She won awards she did not seek and recognition she did not need, satisfied instead by the simple evidence that her work made difference in people's lives. Dante aged gracefully, the silver in his hair spreading, the lines around his eyes deepening, but his energy and acuity undiminished. He remained a formidable presence in any room, but those closest to him saw how he had softened, how his daughter's laugh could disarm him completely, how his wife's opinion carried more weight than any business calculation. They were happy. Not perfectly, not constantly, but truly and deeply happy in a way that Margaret had once believed was reserved for other people, better people, people who had not made the mistakes she had made. On the morning of their 5th wedding anniversary, Margaret woke before dawn and went to the garden where they had been married. The roses were in full bloom, their fragrance heavy in the cool morning air. She stood beneath the arch where they had spoken their vows, and remembered the woman she had been when she first arrived at Thornwood, the terrified refugee from a collapsed marriage, the ghost who had forgotten how to feel alive. That woman was gone now, transformed so completely that she existed only in memory. In her place stood someone stronger and clearer, someone who knew her own worth and lived by her own values, someone who had built a life of purpose and meaning from the ruins of empty ambition. Dante found her there, as she knew he would. He always knew where to find her, always sensed when she needed him, always appeared at exactly the right moment. He wrapped his arms around her from behind and rested his chin on her shoulder, and they watched together as the sun rose over the mountains they both loved. He asked what she was thinking. Margaret leaned back against him and spoke the truth. She was thinking about gratitude. She was thinking about the improbable sequence of events that had brought them together. She was thinking about their daughter sleeping peacefully in her room, dreaming whatever innocent dreams children dream. She was thinking about how wrong everything had gone in her life before, and how right everything had become since. Dante turned her in his arms and kissed her with the tenderness of long familiarity, the kind of kiss that comes from years of knowing someone completely. He told her that she had saved him. He told her that before she arrived, he had been building an empire of power and calling it success. She had shown him that true success was measured in moments like this, in quiet mornings and honest love and the trust of people who mattered. They walked back to the house hand in hand to wake their daughter and begin another day of the life they had chosen, together. Thornwood rose before them, no longer a fortress but a home, its windows reflecting the morning sun like welcoming eyes. This was not the story Margaret had expected. It was better, it was real, and it was hers. If you have watched this far, it is because you like this story. Leave a comment saying I have watched this far so I can get to know you and see who really enjoys the stories here on the channel. Your engagement means the world to me and helps this community grow. And if this story touched your heart, please hit the like button and share it with someone who needs to hear this message of hope and transformation. Subscribe if you have not already and ring that notification bell so you never miss a new story. Because here on this channel we believe that everyone deserves a second chance. We believe that the right person can see through our failures to the potential underneath. We believe that love, real love, can transform not just relationships, but entire lives. Thank you for being here. Thank you for watching. Thank you for being part of this family. Until the next story, remember that your own transformation is always possible. Your own second chance is waiting. Your own Thornwood might be just around the corner, ready to welcome you home. The end.